Welcome back to the Jason Allen Scott Show. Today we're going to be talking about Evan Spiegel and the anti-social network. So here's my question for you. What if the most valuable thing you could build wasn't designed to be addictive, but designed to disappear? Evan Spiegel once said, "Social media businesses represent an aggressive expansion of capitalism into our personal relationships. We're asked to perform for our friends, to create things they like, to work on a personal brand. But humanity cannot be true or false. We are full of contradictions and we change. That is the joy of human life. We are not brands." Over the past weeks, we've looked at Phil Knight's religion of belief and Walt Disney's obsession with control. In today's episode, we're looking at something every founder eventually confronts: the choice between becoming what the world expects or building something the world doesn't yet understand. Today I'm pulling from a book called How to Turn Down $1 Billion, The Snapchat Story by Billy Gallagher, a book that reveals not the sanitized tech success story, but the philosophical rebellion of a 23-year-old who looked at Facebook's empire and said, "This is broken, and we can do better." I'm Jason Allen Scott. This is the Jason Allen Scott Show, a show hosted by me to look at entrepreneurship not through a business lens, but through a philosophical one, to understand that entrepreneurship might be the philosophy we all need, the philosophy that helps us make the best of our lives, the short time we have here on this third rock from the sun. And we look at this philosophy through the lenses of those that came before us, the founders who have quite literally shaped the world. Because Charlie Munger said it best, the greatest lessons are hidden in $3 books. So that's my job, to bring you the stories hidden in $3 books in the hopes that they bring you 3 billion value of knowledge, of expertise, of lessons and stories, so that you can replicate or completely avoid the mistakes that others have made, so that you can stand on the shoulders of giants or completely escape the rat race and do something completely different. Today's story is a story of a college student who built an app his classmates called the dumbest thing ever. A founder who turned down a $3 billion acquisition offer from Mark Zuckerberg at the ripe old age of 23. A CEO who hired a philosopher before hiring a sales team whose ideas mattered more than revenue. And yet, somehow, against every Valley norm, against Zuckerberg's cloning attempts, against the narrative that disappearing photos are just for sexting, it became Snapchat. Because sometimes the only thing more dangerous than building what users ask for is forgetting why they're asking in the first place. And sometimes the only thing more powerful than network effect is understanding that networks, or should I say, is understanding what networks are destroying. This whole story is about what happens when you refuse to conform, when you fight the status quo from the inside out. Act 1, the origins of rebellion. The student who refused to optimize for resumes. Stanford, early 2010. Evan Spiegel is a product design student, but he's not like the others grinding for Goldman Sachs interviews or Google internships. He's taken on as an advisee by David Kelly. David Kelly, if you don't know, is the head of Stanford's famed design school, the D School, as they call it. The one thing that becomes immediately clear in Evan's mind is, I'm not going to work for somebody else. This is, if you know me, you know my story, and if you've been following this podcast or any of the podcasts I've done since 2015, you'll know my mantra that has driven me is to never be a boss and never have a boss. That's it. That's the mantra. I might change directions, I might change ideas, but I never give up on that belief. And Evan wasn't any different. He just said, I'm never going to work for somebody else. And I want you to understand what this realization unlocks. It gives him freedom. Freedom from the heavy grind of Stanford. Nobody will ever see his resume or grades. So he takes classes for what he actually wants to learn, not what looks good on a CV, not what's markable or marketable by the market, but more what he's curious about. And this is specific knowledge in its purest form. And don't forget, specific knowledge cannot be taught. It can only be learned through experience or apprenticeship. Evan is never optimizing for the job market. He's always optimizing for understanding how to look at the things he uses every day and make them just a bit better, just a bit cooler. And that distinction, better and cooler, matters. Most people optimize for one or the other, utility or aesthetics, function or form. Evan wanted both. And he was willing to ignore grades, ignore recruiters, ignore the entire Stanford machinery to figure this out. His first startup was called Future Freshman, a platform for college applicants to get information about schools. And surprise, surprise, it failed. But the failure taught him something crucial. Future Freshman found itself battling well-funded competitors with deep pockets and large sales teams. There were signs too close to home that the product wasn't connecting. Evan later said about this that both of my siblings were applying to college at the time, and neither of them used it. So that was a sign that this was probably not the right way to go. And eventually, Evan pulled the plug. The lesson? In Evan's own words, in order to avoid getting destroyed by better funded competition, my next idea had to be more original. And this echoes something we've talked about before, the blue ocean strategy. You can make more money while having less competition with more original ideas, not better executing of existing ideas, but completely original ideas. Ideas that don't have to have a category or yet to have a category. Ideas that sound crazy until they become obvious. The idea that made everyone uncomfortable. It was late 2011. Evan and his fraternity brothers are sitting around talking shit. More than one member of the frat lives in fear that photographs of their debauchery will come back to haunt them when it's time to get serious and have a career and be important people. Reggie Brown, one of Evan's friends, has an idea. What if people could send each other wild pictures of themselves partying without worrying about future consequences? Evan listens intently. He nods along. Then he starts talking in fast, clipped sentences. How weird is that? How weird is that whoever started the internet and Facebook just decided that everything, everywhere should just stick around forever? Think about that. Someone made a decision early in the internet's design that persistence was the default. That everything you post, everything you share, everything you should say or have said should be permanent, indexed, searchable, forever. Nobody questioned it. It just was. Well, one person questioned it. Evan questioned it. Not from a technical perspective, but from a human perspective. Humans don't work that way. Conversations don't work that way. When you talk to a friend, the words disappear. The moment passes on. You move on. But on the internet, every moment is preserved, catalogued, judged. That changes how we speak, how we live, what we share. It changes everything. It changed how we communicate, what we're willing to say, what we're willing to be online. And Evan saw this and he wanted to fix it. So he built Peekaboo, later renamed Snapchat, a crude messaging app where photos disappeared after they were viewed. And it got an immediate reputation. It was a sexting app. Sexting, by the way, for those that don't know, is texting, but with the idea of sharing lewd or at least sexual connotations via the app. And that reputation, by the way, nearly killed it before it even started. I was once invited to a breakfast by Snapchat in London. I think it was at the Shard. It could have been I definitely think it was the shot. It was with the Founding Network. Thank you to the Founding Network. And I remember the guy from Snapchat saying, who here uses Snapchat? No one put their hands up. I thought that was interesting. And then he said, if I say Snapchat, what do you think of? And I said, disappearing aubergine pictures. And everyone packed out laughing. But it was what everyone was thinking. It was the sexting app. And that reputation was still there years later. The pitch that bombed. June 2011, Stanford. Evans presenting Peekaboo to a class full of entrepreneurial students and professors and venture capitalists. And he's confident, he's comfortable, he's enthusiastic. He explains that not every photograph is meant to last forever, that people would have more fun messaging via pictures if they thought this was true. The response? Let's just say less than enthusiastic. Why would anyone use this app? This is the dumbest thing ever. One venture capitalist suggested Evan make the photos permanent and work with Best Buy for inventory photography. The teaching assistant, he was horrified. He pulls Evan aside. He says, "Did you just build a sexting app?" Gallagher, the author, draws a parallel here that I love. In 1962, a Stanford Business School student named Phil Knight presented a final paper titled, "Can Japanese Sports Shoes Do to German Sports Shoes What Japanese Cameras Did to German Cameras?" His classmates were so bored they didn't ask a single question. And that paper, as you know from the last episode, became Nike. That's why I did Phil Knight's Nike story before this episode. If you haven't yet had a chance, please go listen to that episode. Either now, stop where you are right now, go listen to it, or finish this and go listen to it. It's the episode before this. The VC sitting in Evan's classroom that day likely passed up at least $1 billion return on their investments. But here's what Gallagher notes in his own notes. He says, it's very easy to look at brilliant ideas with the benefit of hindsight and see that they were destined to succeed. With the benefit of hindsight, we can see that Facebook developed the conditions that allowed Snapchat to flourish. But it wasn't all obvious watching Evan's pitch in 2011. It wasn't obvious that this was a natural rebellion against the foundation of Facebook. And this is the founder's dilemma. The best ideas don't make sense until they're obvious. And by the time they're obvious, someone else has already built them. So you have to build before it's obvious, which means enduring the criticism, the confusion, the blank stares. Evan did. Phil Knight did. Act 2, design as a philosophy. The constraints that created the magic. While Evans's class hadn't loved disappearing photos, it was different from what other people were working on. In the 22 Immutable Laws of Marketing, you call this Law 2, the law of category. Be different, be one of one. And Evan knew this, and he thought this was important. And there's that theme again that we see over and over and over. Originality over optimization. Evan talked to his co-founders, Reggie Brown and Bobby Murphy, through the design choices and constraints that he wanted to build into Peekaboo. First, the app would always open directly to a camera, not a feed, not a timeline, a camera. So users could quickly take a photo of whatever they wanted to share. This wasn't about consuming. It was about creating. Second, photos would be impermanent. That word, impermanence, appears multiple times in the book. It's the main thesis for Evan's view on using technology to more accurately mimic how humans naturally communicate. But here's the problem. They couldn't make it impossible for users to screenshot photos. So they came up with a clumsy alternative. Users would have to keep their finger on the screen to view a photo, making it harder to press two buttons and screenshot at the same time. They also built a notification system. If someone screenshotted your photo, you'd find out. This was not on the idea of prevention. It was based on the concept of transparency. Third, the logo. Evan studied the 100 most popular apps in the App Store and noticed none had yellow logos. So to make Peekaboo stand out, ironically, he put the Ghostface Chiller logo on a bright yellow background. This is design thinking. This is thinking from design versus from design decoration. He wasn't trying to make it pretty. He was simply trying to make it different. And these constraints weren't limitations for him. They were the product. There were heroes who shaped his vision. Evan wanted to build Snapchat as an art and technology company. And he modeled this after two heroes of his, Edwin Land and Steve Jobs. Land, founder of Polaroid, inventor of the instant photography. That guy was Steve Jobs' hero. In the 1980s, Apple CEO John Sculley and Jobs visited Land at his lab in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Sculley later recalled from the visit, Dr. Land and Steve were both looking at the center of the table. The whole time they were talking. Dr. Land was saying, I could see what the Polaroid camera should be. It was just as real to me as if it was sitting in front of me before I'd even built it. And then Steve said, yes, that's exactly the way I saw the Macintosh. If I asked someone who had only used a personal calculator what a Macintosh should be like, they couldn't have told me. There was no way to do consumer research on it. I had to go and create it and then show it to people and say, now, what do you think? And then Sculley said something profusely profound. Both of them had this ability to not invent products, but discover products. Both of them said these products have always existed. It's just that no one had ever seen them before. We were the ones who discovered them. Like Land and Jobs, Evan was more discoverer than inventor. He explored the world around him in collage and pulled Snapchat out of it. He didn't believe users could tell him what they wanted. He simply had to discover what was next and then show it to them. This is a complete opposite to the modern product development playbook. There's no groups, there's no focus groups, there's no A/B testing, there's no data-driven decisions. There's conviction, there's vision, and there's taste. Judgment, especially demonstrated judgment with a high accountability and a clear track record, is always critical. Evan had judgment, not experience, not yet, not credentials, definitely not, but judgment, and he was willing to bet everything on it. The growth tactics nobody ever talks about. It was the early days of Evan and Bobby, but they knew that Snapchat had value because everyone who used the app used it all the time. They just needed to get it into more people's hands. This is a very important part for you founders out there. Business is very, very simple. It's advertising to get people to know about the product or service that you have. It's sales. Once people know about the product or service that you have, they speak to you and you convince them that the product or service you have solves a pain that they have and that they're willing to pay for because of the value of the product or service is so much greater than the pain in which they're feeling. So they're willing to pay to get that. And then there's product or service, which has to be so good that people keep buying it. You don't have to keep selling it again and advertising it again and again to more people. And he knew this. He knew that the product was good. People were using it over and over and over and over. He just needed more people to know about it. He needed advertising. So what did they do? They did what Y Combinator talks about, which is do things in the beginning that don't scale. So they started showing it to people one by one. They gave it to 12-year-olds. They explained why it was fun. Evan would download the app for them on their phones for them. And this is crucial. The UI was confusing at the start. If you'd used Snapchat, especially if just a few years before, right? Even if it's just 7 years, by the way, 5 years before, right now, listening to this, it wasn't intuitive. It required teaching. But once someone showed you, once you had that one-on-one interaction, you got it. And you were hooked. And Evan was willing to try anything. When he was home, he'd go to the shopping mall and hand out flyers advertising Snapchat. He'd walk up to people and say, hey, would you like to send a disappearing picture? And they'd say no. And he'd move to the next person. This is founder level hustle. It's not scalable. It's not elegant. It's not eloquent, but it is effective because every user matters. Every conversion is progress. October 2011. Evan opens Flurry, an analytics dashboard, and notices something strange. New users are signing up in Orange County, California. And there seems to be an activity spike between 8 a.m. and 3 p.m. In other words,
what?
School hours.
What?
It turns out that, that Evan's mother had told his cousin, a high school student, about Snapchat. And she and her friends had downloaded the app on school-distributed iPads. And those iPads blocked Facebook. They started using Snapchat as a way to pass notes in class. Snapchat fed the high schoolers' desire for attention. They could see when the recipient opened their snap. And it started catching on in small clusters at various high schools in Orange County and then Los Angeles. And then these students would go home for the holidays and they would tell others. Many found iPhones with front-facing cameras in their stockings for Christmas. Teenagers began taking selfies using the front-facing camera and sending them to each other via Snapchat, having entire conversations through images of their faces. From December to January, Snapchat user base grew 10 times over. From just over 2,000 daily active users to over 20,000 daily active users. Snapchat broke out from a note-passing gimmick to a full-fledged communication tool. It replaced texting for so many teens. It was never planned. It was discovered. Evan didn't target high schoolers. High schoolers found Evan. And once they did, they told everyone. Because Snapchat solved a real problem, a problem they didn't even know they had. Freedom from permanence. Act 3, the rebellion against Facebook. You see, the problem Facebook created, at least the way Evan saw it, but nobody could articulate at the time, is that Facebook was boring for teens. They and their friends posted less content, less personal content, sometimes no content, once their parents joined. Facebook notifications, the once thrilling red marker signifying that you had your friend's attention, now came with a mark all as read button. This was more reminiscent of an email inbox than a fun social app between cool people. And because people rarely deleted all posts and photos, their profiles became dusty collections of mementos they'd posted years ago and never gone back to look at, and maybe never wanted to. This wasn't a big problem for people who signed up later in life, by the way. They arrived at the Facebook party as mostly their formed selves, right? Boomers are boomers. Same with Gen Xers, my generation. We already are ourselves, so putting up stuff doesn't really change from 30 to 50. But it does if you're growing up. How many times have we watched people grow up in Disney films and movies and then been shocked by who they became? And they're embarrassed about who they were. These people were signing up during a time of enormous change and growth. They didn't want these profiles to represent them because they were representing weird versions of them that no longer existed, that they no longer wanted to be associated with. It was like they outgrew sneakers or clothes that had gone out of style. And these profiles needed to be tossed out and replaced with something fresh and new. And of course, there was always the fear. Something dumb they posted on social media would get them in trouble later on with their parents or with college admission officers or future employers or girlfriends, boyfriends, partners, friends. And teenagers also felt pressure to post the most glamorous representations of their lives on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. Why? To rack up likes. Evan designed Snapchat as an antidote to this obsession with likes and retweets. Snapchat was never meant to be a social network. It was designed as a small private network simply to share with your closest friends. And I want to pause here because this is important. When Snapchat went through a major redesign in 2018, separating friends you knew from Snapchat from celebrities you followed, people were furious. But Evan kept saying, these people are not your friends. That's why they're in a separate category. He explicitly designed Snapchat as an antidote to the modern social network. Snapchat had no likes. It had no permanence. It had no social anxiety. You could send whatever you thought was funny or cool or interesting, even if that was an otherwise unflattering image of yourself. Why do I dress up sometimes, right? Not dress up, but I'll put a nice jacket on, or I'll put a nice t-shirt on, or I'll put a shirt on, or I'll wear a nice hat. And then sometimes I'm like this. Because I want you to, and I haven't shaved, because I want you to see me as me. I want to take away the ego. I want to remove it. I want to just represent the stories I'm telling, the lessons that I'm hoping we're learning together. And some lessons I've learned before because I've read this book multiple times, or read this book, or read that book. But sometimes I'm reminding myself of the lessons as I start my own new thing. And I want you to be a part of all of it. Hence the unflattering image you see before you. You're so beautiful. And Evan and Bobby were careful to set up Snapchat to maintain and promote this intimacy. While most apps at the time let you find and add friends via Facebook login or by uploading email contacts, Snapchat only let you add people if you had their phone number or username. Because of this, most people had a smaller group of closer friends on Snapchat than on any other social network. And they managed to make Snapchat feel like a small, cool club that you alone belong to, and some tight-knit friends. A welcome escape, by the way, from the Facebook empire. Everyone brags about how many followers they have. And in those early days, if you sent a snap to Team Snapchat, Evan or Bobby would occasionally reply with a selfie. They didn't let users upload photos from the camera roll. Any photo you sent via Snapchat had to be taken in the app and immediately shared, giving it an unparalleled sense of real-time interaction. When you received a Snapchat for 10 seconds, you were transported to where your friend was at that exact moment in time. Evan later articulated this brilliantly. He said, if Instagram is the prettiest 1% of all photographs, Snapchat would happily host the rest of the 99%. It was never supposed to be a highlight reel. It was supposed to be the real. The investor term sheet that taught him everything. Early 2012, Jeremy Liu, L-I-E-W, and Lightspeed invest in Snapchat's first funding round. But Liu includes terms giving Lightspeed the rest of first refusal to invest in. Snapchat's next round, plus rights to take 50% of the next round. What does this mean? Essentially, it means Lightspeed controls Snapchat's next round of funding and makes Snapchat unattractive to other investors. They're basically saying, you choose us and we get all these perks, which is great for us, but makes anyone else coming in think they get an unfair deal. And by the way, Evan knows this, and Evan is furious. He feels betrayed. He feels taken advantage of. Liu had told him these terms were, inverted commas, standard. And years later, Evan warns other students about this at a Stanford Women in Business conference. He says, in his own words, one of my biggest mistakes as an entrepreneur involved a term sheet. This particular term sheet was our first, and when we talked to our venture capitalists and our lawyers, they took refuge in this notion of a standard. When I asked a question because I didn't understand something, I was reassured that the term was standard and therefore agreeable. I forgot that the idea of standard is a construct. It simply does not need to exist, and it simply does not exist. So rather than attempt to further understand the document, I accepted it. It wasn't until later, when the company had grown and we needed more money, that I realized I'd made an expensive mistake. In a 2015 talk, by the way, at USC, he said, if you hear the words standard terms, then figure out exactly what actually the terms are, because they're probably not standard. And the person explaining them to you probably also doesn't know how they work. He was teaching accountability in action. But Evan didn't blame the VCs. He didn't even blame the lawyers. He took responsibility. He learned through the lesson and he shared it publicly, often. so others wouldn't need to repeat it. Evan drops out of Stanford, close to graduating, maybe 5 or so classes less than he should have. He decides to go all in on Snapchat. But he still chooses to walk at commencement. He receives a blank diploma rather than skip the celebration, where all his friends are. 3 years later, delivering a commencement address at USC's Marshall School of Business, he said, "It only recently occurred to me, while preparing this address, how totally absurd this whole charade was. It reminded me that oftentimes we do all sorts of silly things to avoid appearing different. Conforming happens so naturally that we forget how powerful it is. We want to be accepted by our peers. We want to be part of the group. It's in our biology. But the things that make us human are those times when we listen to the whispers of our soul and allow ourselves to be pulled in another direction. And this is the central tension of entrepreneurship, the pull between conformity and conviction, between fitting in and standing out, between what's safe and what's true. We know that Evan chose truth, even when it looked absurd. The meeting that was really a threat, November 28th, 2012. Mark Zuckerberg, having just purchased Instagram, emails Evan. He's interested in Snapchat. He'd love to have them over to Facebook's campus. And Evan responds coolly. He's not sure where next he'll be in the Bay Area. Delivering the not-so-subtle message, he's not planning a special trip just to see the Facebook billionaire, is basically what he's saying. And Zuckerberg notes he'll be in Los Angeles soon. Maybe they can meet then. Days later, Evan and Bobby travel to a private apartment in Los Angeles to meet Zuckerberg in secret. Zuckerberg had obfuscated, big word of the day, the purpose of the trip, saying he was meeting architect Frank Gehry to discuss Facebook's new headquarters. But that wasn't why he was there. Zuckerberg began to ask probing questions about Snapchat, what their vision was for the product, for the company. Then he wonders aloud what Snapchat might look like if it was a Facebook-owned company. With Evan and Bobby still in the helm, able to take advantage of Facebook's resources and funding to grow more quickly, as Instagram had just done. And Zuckerberg has a very impressive story to tell. Following his acquisition, Instagram's daily active users grew almost 1,200% in 6 short months. Perhaps Facebook would be interested in acquiring Snapchat, say for $60 million. Instantly making Evan and Bobby millionaires in their early 20s. Evan explains, coolly, they're just not interested in selling the company. Then Zuckerberg shows them something new, something his team has been working on. It's called PYNK, and it's a new Facebook app to be released in a few short days.
What is it? What is it? What is it?
A messaging app for disappearing photos and videos. The message is clear. Join us, or we will crush you. This next chapter is called The Clone That Backfired. It was December 21st, 2012. Evan receives a 1-sentence email from Zuckerberg. I hope you enjoy PYNK. Evan had deactivated his Facebook account. He can't even access the app. But in a panic, he calls Bobby, who downloads PYNK and makes an account. It's an exact replica of Snapchat. An unabashed copy. PYNK even steals Snapchat's user interface for recording video. And in addition to sending disappearing photos and videos, users can send disappearing text messages and even poke each other, like the earliest days of Facebook. But here's the thing, there's nothing fun about PYNK. This is a show of might from Zuckerberg and his team. Veteran Facebook director of product Blake Ross led a small team developing PYNK, by the way, and it took him 12 days. Zuckerberg, who rarely programmed at Facebook anymore, even wrote some of the code himself. That tells you how much he wanted this. If users dragged their message list all the way up in the PYNK app, the text would say, "I'll find something to put here," appeared. The same text Zuckerberg left at the bottom of Facebook.com in its earliest days. and the notification that said, poke? A recording of Zuckerberg saying the word poke. In fact, here's a quote from Zuckerberg on this very strategy. If you're trying to help convince people that they want to join you, helping them understand all the pain they would have to go through is a valuable tactic. He intended to show Evan and Snapchat the pain they would have to suffer if they were to compete against him and Facebook. On launch day, in case you wondered, Poke shot to the #1 spot in the iOS App Store, pushing Snapchat all the way down to 9th. But 7 days later, Poke dropped to the 34th spot, and Snapchat rose back to 3rd. You might be asking yourself, why did the clone fail? Well, a tech blogger and venture capitalist wrote this. He said, how is it that Facebook, which has some of the smartest folks in the room, can't really invent any new single online behavior that would keep people addicted to Facebook? Why does it have to look at others to come up with new user behavior and new features? Check-ins, well, they came from Foursquare. Short status updates were a direct response to Twitter. Facebook Answers was merely a variation on Quora. And Poke is yet another example. So why did Poke fail? It failed to solve any problems for young users who are more than happy with the problem being solved by Snapchat. And it solved a problem that didn't exist for older users who still didn't get the appeal of disappearing content. Facebook's strategy with Poke was to have a family of separate, highly successful apps: Facebook, Messenger, Instagram, and Poke. But Poke was hampered by a fatal flaw. Teens were drawn to Snapchat because it was explicitly not Facebook, which was populated by their parents and collected everything they posted forever. Most of their friends were either on Snapchat or signing up at this point. And they were signing up by the day, every day. They had no interest in Poke messaging with their Facebook friends, who they weren't even friends with anymore, and who, if they were friends with, were on Snapchat already. Why would they pick up and leave Snapchat to share pictures on Poke when half the reason they migrated to Snapchat was to escape the Facebook empire? Within weeks, mere weeks, it became clear Poke hadn't just failed. It actually went out and helped Snapchat. Searches for and mentions of Snapchat skyrocketed weeks following the weeks of Poke's debut. More importantly, Zuckerberg failed an attempt at acquisition, then clone, and validated the ephemeral messaging space and helped change the sexting narrative that had been dodging Snapchat from day one. Despite users sharing over 1 billion images through the service, Snapchat had always struggled to be taken seriously. Many people, particularly those over 25, still thought of it as a sexting app or a toy. But by having the dominant social network take impermanent photos and share them seriously, well, Poke had helped change the story. The logic changed. The photos disappear. Snapchat must be for sexting. That was the idea, but it changed. It changed to Facebook made a disappearing photo app. Disappearing photos must be the next big thing. Evan would later call Poke the greatest Christmas present we ever had. Act 5, the philosophy of impermanence. The thinker who shaped Snapchat's vision. Evan turns his attention to Nathan Jurgensen, a PhD student at the University of Maryland. In 2011, Jurgensen wrote on his social sciences blog called Cybergology, introducing a term he called digital dualism. He argued that the distinction between the virtual and real world is simply a fallacy. He rejected the notion that we live and act one way in person, but build and create a separate identity online. In Jurgensen, Evan found a provocative thinker who managed to capture and describe Snapchat's core ethos before he'd even heard of the app. Jurgensen would go on to influence Evan's thinking and Snapchat's strategy in a truly deep way. In February 2013, Jurgensen wrote about Snapchat. He said, the tension between experience for its own sake and experience we pursue just to put it on Facebook is reaching its breaking point. That breaking point is called Snapchat. After reading the piece, Evan reached out to Jurgensen and convinced him to join Snapchat as a researcher. Not a product manager, not a designer, a researcher. It's so rare for a startup to hire someone so early just to focus on researching and new thinking that may have no direct relevance to the product. But Evan understood something most founders missed. Ideas precede products. Philosophy precedes features. If you don't understand why you're building something, you'll eventually build the wrong thing. Jurgensen would speak with Evan often, and Jurgensen's thoughts and writings eventually had a significant impact on the way Evan thought about Snapchat, about social media, and the internet more broadly. Evan would frequently quote Jurgensen and discuss his ideas in interviews with journalists. I love this. It's long-term thinking. It's allowing compounding to happen by stepping out of its way. He didn't sit there and think, how do we grow faster? He sat there and thought, what are we actually building and why are we actually building it? The product that accidentally solved group messaging. September 2013. Whenever anyone at Snapchat asked the users what additional features they wanted, the response was always universal. From Oslo to Santa Monica, users wanted group messaging. Tired of combing through their lists of contacts to send a funny picture to everyone in their clique, users wanted to create groups. Groups that they could send group text messages to. But Evan and the Snapchat team worried that group messaging would kill the magic of Snapchat. If users could easily fire off mass Snapchats to big groups of people all the time, it might destroy the vibe that they'd worked so hard to create. But was there a better way to create a one-to-many sharing tool than group messaging? Well, Evan and his team knew what they didn't want to create. I want you to listen to this insight. One of Evan's strengths is the ability to see issues in his social feeds and circles and extrapolate them broadly to get into the very heads and brains and minds and hearts of its users. When users first signed up for Facebook, it was amazing. All their friends were on it. They could post funny things and goofy pictures. But all those posts built over time and started becoming representations of people. It created this thing we hear every day today, which is personal brand. And it turns out a lot of work to create or curate a personal brand happens by the spanning of many years. And it's cool to your peers. It's acceptable to your parents and work colleagues and future friends and colleagues, but it might be so different to you. At some point, you were supposed to go back and what? Unlike Sean Paul? Or Bill Cosby? Or would your friends understand that 10 years ago, you loved that man, and now you don't. Now you get it, the messenger and the message. And what about the photos from 2007? Is there a button for deleting every photo before 2026? Why did you think that haircut was a good idea? That stupid cap of a team you never supported. And so users started posting less frequently. They started sharing news articles instead of silly pictures. Their spontaneity, goofiness, and lightness of social media was replaced. Instead of throwing Polaroids at friends across the room, you were curating a gallery of professionally framed high-class photos. I'm guilty of this. I find myself putting a photograph up on Instagram just because I want to share a message with myself. My entire social media is just posting to myself, trying to understand what I was thinking at the time, what I believed in at the time. It's a timeline, my timeline of my thinking, of my developing, of my evolution. And if someone else finds value in that, great, but I'm not posting for them. But then I'll look at my Instagram and I'll be like, that's not a good representation of me. My hair's not that straight. I've got wavy, curly, crazy hair. I'm, English, Iberian, Nigerian, Kenyan, Asian, right? I've got crazy features. I was like, why am I not showing all that? Snapchat understood this. He understood that your news feed would also have to be impermanent. All the content would disappear at some point, just like the disappearing messages that had set this whole thing ablaze at the start. That way, users would feel comfortable posting whatever suited their mood in the moment without worrying about how it looked months and years later. I still haven't deleted pictures of my exes on my Instagram. Since the day I started, I think I've deleted one picture ever. So to get away from the manicured photos, filling Instagram and Facebook, competing for likes, Snapchat's feed would do away with likes and comments. Users could post whatever they wanted. And if their friends really wanted to respond, they could send them a reaction Snapchat. And that reaction Snapchat By the way, that became stories. The psychological candy of being watched. There's a controversial decision. Evan argued it was awkward and insincere when people pretended in real-world interactions that they hadn't been watching their friends' lives unfold through social media. So he argued, why not just show people who's watching the stories? And there was concern that this would deter people from watching multiple people's stories. Ultimately, they decided the risk was worth taking for the trade-off of addicting users to seeing all their friends who would watch their stories. This lust turned out to be psychological candy for users, as they could scroll through and see exactly who watched their story. And I'll tell you something interesting about this. I didn't even know that about Snapchat. I know on TikTok, there is these two little feet, shows you how old I am. And if you click that, I can see who of my contacts has been looking at my feed. So you know who you are, and I see you looking at me. And that's okay. It doesn't change what I post. And there is something about that. Like, but some people love that. They get addicted to that. And I think there was definitely one person where I was like, I wonder if they will look today. And by the way, this phenomenon was by no means new then, and it's not new now. It's what, MySpace founder Tom Anderson did. In fact, it was the number one feature of MySpace that the MySpace users begged for was who's viewed my profile. With stories, Snapchat was taking its first steps towards competing with Facebook's most important product, the newsfeed. But here's the brilliance of stories. The brilliance of stories was that everything wasn't in it. There was no permanence, no fancy editing, no likes, no follow accounts, no comments. Users could just post whatever they wanted. I love this. It's designed by subtraction. Not what can we add, what can we remove? Most companies add features to compete, and Snapchat was removing them. And that creates something. It creates something fundamentally different. He had a plan. He had a framework. And there was a speech in January 2014 that I think revealed everything. Evan gives a keynote where he reveals his entire framework for Snapchat. He talks about how Steve Jobs tied man to machine with the creation of the iPhone, letting users bring computers wherever they go, tied uniquely to them by nothing but a phone number. Evan argues this should be called the more personal computer era rather than the post-personal computer era. And then he unveils his framework, through which everything, acquisitions, new features, revenue, everything is developed. And here it is in his own words. Internet everywhere means that your old conception of the world separated into an online and offline space is no longer relevant. Traditional social media require that we live experiences in the offline world. We record those experiences and then we post them online to recreate the experience so we can talk about it. For example, I go on vacation, I take a bunch of pictures, I come back home, I pick the good ones, I post them online, and I talk about them with my friends. This traditional social media view of identity is actually quite radical. You are the sum of your published experiences, otherwise known as pics, or it didn't happen, right? Or in the case of Instagram, beautiful pics, or it didn't happen, and you're not cool. This notion of a profile made a lot of sense in the binary experience of online and offline. It was designed to create who I am online so that people would interact with me, even if it wasn't logged in at that particular moment. And Snapchat relies on internet everywhere to provide a totally different experience. Snapchat says that you are not the sum of everything you had said or done or experienced or published, that you are the result. We are who we are today, right now. We no longer have to capture the real world and recreate it online. We simply have to live and communicate at the same time. We simply live and communicate at the same time. Not live, then document, then share. We simply live and communicate at the same time, but live while sharing. And this is the fundamental reconception of what social media is for. Communication relies on the creation of media and is constrained by the speed at which that media is created and shared. It takes time to package your emotions, feelings, and thoughts into media content, like speech writing or photography. Don't get me wrong, humans have always used media to understand themselves and to share that with others. The famous poet Robert Burns said, "Oh, would some power the gift give us to see ourselves as others see us." When Evan heard that quote, he couldn't help but think of self-portraits, or for millennials and Gen Zs, etc., the selfie. Self-portraits help us understand the way others see us. They represent how we feel, where we are, and what we're doing. They are arguably the most popular form of self-expression. In the past, lifelike self-portraits took weeks and millions of brushstrokes to compete and complete. And in the world of fast and easy media creation, the selfie is immediate. It represents who we are and how we felt right now, at that moment when the photo was taken. And until now, the photographic process was far too slow for conversations. But with fast and easy media creation, we are able to communicate through photos, not just communicate around them like we did on social media before. Communicate through photos, not just communicate around them. This is Evan's great insight. On Instagram, you post a photo and people comment around it. On Snapchat, you send a photo and people respond through it. It's the difference between broadcasting and conversing, between what I'm doing and hopefully what you respond in the comments, between performance and connection. That's why I want to start doing lives. When we start communicating through media, we light up. It's fun. The selfie makes sense as the fundamental unit of communication on Snapchat because it marks the transition between digital media as self-expression and digital media as a form of communication. And I think that brings us to the importance of ephemerality at its core of conversation. Snapchat discards content to focus on the feeling that content brings to you, not the way that content looks. It's a conservative idea, the natural response to radical transparency that restores integrity and context to a conversation. Snapchat sets expectations around conversations that mirror the expectations that we have when we're talking in person. That's why Snapchat is all about talking through content and around it with friends, not strangers. Identity tied to now, today, with room for growth, emotional risk, expression, mistakes, and room for you. Talking through content, not around it, with friends, not strangers. With friends, not strangers. Listen to that. Separating friends you actually Snapchat with from celebrities you follow. And big surprise, when he did that, people were furious. But Evan was explicit about why he wouldn't change it back. You're supposed to communicate with friends, not strangers. Celebrities are not your friends. And in most cases, let's be honest, they're just trying to sell you something. It's completely anti-ethical to Instagram influencers, to following Kevin Hart on Facebook. They're not your friends. We have a listener. D, you know who you are? I think D's maybe commented on like one of my posts in the last 5 years. But I guarantee if I go to Kate Beckinsale's page, he's commented a bunch of times. Why? She is not your friend. She's probably going to try and sell you something. I am your friend. And that's Evan's point. And it's a great point. April 2014. Evan gives a keynote revealing his philosophy on the distinction between privacy and secrecy. This is a big one. In his own words, he says, "Unfortunately, privacy is too often explained as secrecy, when, as Helen Nissenberg points out, privacy is actually focused on an understanding of context, not what is said, but where it is said and to whom it is said. Privacy allows us to enjoy and learn from the intimacy that is created when we share different things with different people in different contexts." That to me is really just picking up on a fundamental truth of human nature. We share different things with different people in different contexts. Therefore, why our social apps are just one to many. In private, we badmouth our friends and use bad language. Then we act differently in private than in public. It's everyone's most conspicuous experience, but it is the very ground of the life of the individual. Curiously, the obvious fact remains unconscious, unacknowledged, forever obscured by lyrical dreams of the transparent glass house. It is rarely understood to be the value one must defend above all else. I know that seems complicated and convoluted and verbose, but before the internet, the division between our public and private lives were usually tied to our physical location, our work, and our home. The context to which we communicated with friends and family was clear. At work, we were professionals. At home, we were husbands, sons, wives, and daughters. On the internet, we organize information by its popularity in an attempt to determine its validity. We organize information by its popularity in an attempt to determine its validity. If a website has been more referenced by any other website, it's generally determined to be more valuable or more accurate. Feelings are expressed on social media are quantified, validated, and distributed in the same fashion. Popular expression becomes the most valuable expression. Social media businesses represent an aggressive expansion of capitalism into our personal relationships. I want to say that again. Listen to me clearly. Social media businesses represent an aggressive expansion of capitalism into our personal relationships. We are asked to perform for our friends, to create things they like, to work on a personal brand, and brands teach us that authenticity is the result of consistency. So we must honor our true self and represent the same self to all our friends, or we risk being discredited. That's ridiculous. Humanity cannot be true or false. We are all full of contradictions, and we change. And that is the joy of human life. We are not brands. It is simply not in our nature. Recently, I wrote to a friend and I said, why you can't post that? The person that wrote that is gorgeous and has no idea what the real world is like because there's something called the halo effect. Look into it. And he responded backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards. And then eventually he put the same post up, but he didn't use the person anymore. He said, is this better? And I said, no, because now you're just stealing their thoughts without even crediting them. And he said, well, isn't it something you've done? And I said, yes, I have done that in the past. And I've learned that it was wrong. And now I don't do it. Right? That's the joy of human life. That is what education is. Your behavior changes based on something you heard or read. I love that he gets this, that we are not brands. It is not in our nature. And that is the philosophical core of Snapchat. That is why Snapchat is on this podcast, a philosophy podcast through the eye of entrepreneurship. Humans are not brands. Relationships are not markets. Conversations are not performances. And technology, when designed correctly, should restore humanity, not extract it. Late 2013, Mark Zuckerberg offers Snapchat $3 billion. Evan Spiegel, our hero, is 23 years old, and he turns it down. Not because he's arrogant, not because he wants more money, but because selling doesn't align with what he's trying to build. Remember his mantra, I'm not going to work for someone else. That's his identity. That's not his ego. That's not bravado. Evan doesn't sell Snapchat to get acquired. He didn't build Snapchat to get acquired. He built it because he believed that Facebook was broken. And you can't fix a broken system by joining it. You have to build the alternative. Jeff Bezos famously wrote in one of his shareholder letters, we all know that if you swing for the fences, you're going to strike out a lot. But you're also going to hit some home runs. The difference between baseball and business, however, is that baseball has a certain number, a guaranteed truncated outcome distribution. Basically saying, when you swing, no matter how well you connect with the ball, the most runs you can get is 4. But in business, every once in a while, you can step up to the plate and you can score 1,000 runs. This is the long tail distribution of returns. This is why it's important. This is why it's important to be brave, to be bold. You get me? Big winners pay for many experiments. And Evan understood this. 3 billion is a lot of money. It's life-changing money. It's ridiculous amounts of money. But it's a truncated, guaranteed outcome. If Snapchat could become what Evan believed it can, a more personal computer, a new way of communicating, a platform for billions, the upside is orders of magnitude larger than that offer. Not just financially, culturally. It's a chance to reshape how we as humans connect. That's not something you sell for 3 billion, even at the young age of 23. So I like to end these podcasts with a question. So here's my question to you. What if the most dangerous thing you can do isn't failing, but succeeding at something that doesn't matter? If Spiegel could have accepted Zuckerberg's $3 billion offer, he could have joined Facebook. He could have become a successful executive at the most dominant social network in the world. His classmates would have been impressed. His investors would have been thrilled. His family would have been proud, we assume. But we also assume he'd be miserable. Because Evan didn't build Snapchat to be acquired. He built it because he believed something fundamental was broken about how we communicate online. You can't fix a problem by joining it. So here's what I want you to take away from Evan's story, and there's a lot, but here's mine. Firstly, originality compounds differently than optimization. Evan could have built a better photo sharing app, a faster messaging app, a more efficient social network, but those would have been incremental improvements. Basically, better execution of existing ideas. But Evan built something original, an app where photos disappear, where there are no likes, where you communicate with friends, not strangers. It sounded crazy. Classmates called it the dumbest thing ever, and as we know, VCs passed. But originality doesn't need to make sense to everyone. It needs to make sense to someone. And for teenagers, escaping Facebook's permanent record, it just made sense. Remember the rule: specific knowledge is found by pursuing your genuine curiosity and passion rather than whatever is hot right now. Evan pursued impermanence when everyone else pursued permanence. He had taste when everyone else was executing strategy at scale. I mentioned before that Evan hired a philosopher, Nathan Jurgensen. We talked about him. He did it before hiring a sales team. Not because he needed it more, definitely not because a philosophy person would generate revenue, but because ideas generate products. And products without ideas eventually become features. They become commodities. They become copies. Evan understood that Snapchat wasn't competing with Facebook on features. It was competing on worldview. Facebook believes you are the sum of your published experiences. And Snapchat believes you are who you are now, today. That's a philosophical difference, not a product difference. And a philosophical difference can't be copied in 12 days, no matter how smart your engineers are. The third thing I want you to take away from this is that constraints are the product. Snapchat always opens to a camera. Photos disappear. There's no likes, there's no comments, there's no followers. Every one of those things feels like a limitation, feels like a cage, but they're not limitations to Snapchat, they're features. By removing permanence, Evan removes performance anxiety. By removing likes, he removes status games. And by removing followers, he restores intimacy. Most companies will compete on features. And Snapchat has competed by removing all of them. He's created something fundamentally different. For that, I applaud him. Fourth, humanity is not a brand. Social media businesses represent an aggressive expansion of capitalism into our personal relationships. We are asked to perform for our friends, to create things they like, to work on our personal brand. But humanity cannot be true or false We are full of contradictions and we change. This is the joy of human life. We are not brands. It is simply not in our nature. This is his moral philosophy. The question isn't how do we make users engage? It's how do we make technology more human? And sometimes, a lot of the time, the answer is by doing less. So here's my challenge. Identify one area where you're optimizing for what's expected instead of what's true. I want you to ask the question, what would I build if I wasn't trying to impress anyone? Not trying to impress investors, not trying to impress users, not trying to impress my peers, not my family, just what feels right. What constraints could I add that would make the product more human, even if that made it less efficient? Think of Evan's disappearing photos. What would your version of that be? Where am I trying to be a brand when I should just be a person? Where am I performing instead of connecting? And do the hard thing. Remove something. Don't add a feature. Subtract one. Don't optimize for more engagement. Optimize for more humanity. Don't ask, how do we grow faster? Ask, what are we actually building and why are we building it? Evan Spiegel turned down $3 billion at 23 because he believed Snapchat could be more than an exit. It could be a new way of communicating, a rebellion against permanence, a reminder that we are human, but we are not brands. That's conviction. And conviction, when paired with taste and patience and a willingness to endure mockery, compounds into something that we've seen as unstoppable. Next time on the Jason and Scott Show, we'll explore a founder who built an empire by fighting competitors while building and redefining a category entirely. Until then, I'd like to ask you to seek originality, to build without constraints, to remember you are not a brand. I'm Jason Allen Scott, Sawubona. I see you.